Well, good morning if you are somewhere in Korea or Alaska. Good afternoon. If you're in New York City, as I am, or Rio de Janeiro, good evening. If you are in Iceland or England or Tel Aviv, greetings to people all over the world, and welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. As you know, Adagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans all around the world. I always like to have people on whose work I admire, but whom I have never spoken to personally, because it gives me the opportunity to find out all kinds of things I'd like to know. And I hope I'm doing this on behalf of you, the listener. My guest today is the composer and performer, Nimrod Borenstein, who joins me, I believe, from the United Kingdom. I didn't even ask where. That's okay. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I'm in London today.
You're in London today. Very good. Well, welcome. Because you and I have never spoken, I'm going to ask you the most basic question. You, like many composers, musicians I know, were alerted to your musical gifts quite young. You remember how it happened that music suddenly became the light bulb that went off and you had to do it after that?
Yeah, well, I don't remember actually, but I remember my parents telling me the story because, as you say, I was 3 years old and I can't remember it. Basically, I cannot remember a world without music because it's so young that I can't remember. But apparently, we were on a holiday and I was 3 years old, a working holiday in the part of France that is between France, because I grew up in France, and Germany. So the dark forest, uh,
Mm-hmm.
the Black Forest, it's called.
Black Forest, yeah.
And there was we went on a walk, and it was summer. And when we came back, it was around seven something, probably. And there was a concert, an outside concert with a full orchestra. And I asked my parents to stop. And they thought that I would, I was a 3 years old child that I would watch for 2 minutes and go. But no, I watched for the full concert. And after the concert, I told my parents that I wanted to be a musician.
Uh-huh.
Which, when I grew up with this story and I was a child, and to me it seemed totally normal. I said, okay, well, what's the big deal about that? But when I grew up and I have two children. I realized that it's really, really uncommon. People usually don't know what they want to do from their life age 3. But in my case, I knew, and doesn't mean that I really love mathematics, for example. And but I always knew that I was going to be a musician.
I remember that when I was very young, I had to go to the dentist a lot. And I had a very nice dentist. So I said, I want to be a dentist. I quickly understood I did not want to be a dentist. Then I got my first pair of shoes and I wanted to be a shoe salesman. I quickly did not want to do that. But I pretty early on understood I wanted to be in the performing arts by the time I was 6 or 7 and pointed toward that. Um, I quickly understood I did not want to be an actor because I did not like repeating the same thing. That was not of interest to me. I did some acting as a child. I then transferred into production design, direction for opera, for theater, but especially for opera. And music, I very happily had a musical education to go with it, but I knew that my musical education would not be as a performer, but to support working in production and design and working for opera companies and to some degree for symphonies. Um, because music came to you so very young, and to me also as a child because my father was a musician. Um, do you think perhaps that your first language might be music? And that French or Hebrew or English or whatever languages you speak are subsequent languages, but that music was there first?
I never thought about it, so let me think about it. Um, no, for me, I think that art is something not natural. And I will explain what I mean. I think that as human beings, we are not perfect, none of us. Even the great masters like Mozart or Beethoven are not, as human beings, are just human beings. But if you are a great artist, you are capable of creating perfection on absolute. And so in that sense, I think that it wouldn't make sense to talk about it as a language that I could speak. I think that it takes another place. I myself, I'm not a believer in God, but I think that music is definitely spiritual. It's of this realm, whether you believe or not. And of course, it is a language in the sense that often when I explain my music to performers or I give examples, I'll give you an example, okay? So it's the easiest way to think. You think about Bach first the violin concerto in A minor, pam 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 pa da 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 pam, and then it continues. So you've got, as a composer, I think immediately it's something short, pam pam, something short, pam pam, and then pam pa da 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 pam, which is sort of and you could do it two ways. You could do it sort of let's say soft, and then loud, like pam 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 pam, and then tam pa da 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 pam. Or the opposite, like pam 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 pam, and then soft pam pa da 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 da. Because the real thing in that is like if you said short things. Let's say I bought some bread, so it's pam pam. I bought some cheese, pam pam. On the conclusion, I'm going to have a great meal. Pam, pa, da, 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 da. But let's say that you don't like the bread on the cheese. So the answer will be quite dumb. Pam, 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 and then pam, pa, da, 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 da. But whatever you do, the construction is a language construction. And you could sort of always, for any type of music at any time, there is these beats that are almost like language. But as a composer, you don't construct them like that.
I love that analogy.
I could do it with different food. I love my food, so
Because we don't know each other, you may not know that I've written 8 cookbooks.
Oh, wow, I'm interested.
Yeah, and food is a big part of my language, my expression, and I see it as rooted in culture, but I see it rooted in emotion and nourishment. I'm not about fancy food. I'm about food that nourishes. I believe that food should be clean, safe, and affordable for everyone. And that if someone is hungry, then I'm not properly fed because something is wrong. And similarly, I believe about music that if we taught the ability to read music to every person in the world, we would have fewer conflicts because we would have the common language of music so that we could sit down with people who are not, we don't speak their spoken language. We may be from completely different backgrounds, but if we can sit down for choral work, at a piano, whatever, and share that, even if we can't converse, that it's a commonality, and food is that same commonality. And so therefore, I seriously believe there's something called the slow food movement, and I'm one of the founders. The idea that food be safe, clean, affordable, available, and that it respect the environment, and that we not do the kind of agriculture that abuses the soil, but also the kind of food preparation that can make us sick. And similarly with music, we don't have to share a love for the same kind of music. You were just giving the example of Bach. I know that I would not have called up Bach as my example. I would have called up Berlioz or Rossini, but that's my heartbeat. But the point is, you can sit with me and look at the Berlioz score. I can sit with you and look at the Bach score, and we can find commonality with that. And so I love your analogy about it may not be good cheese and it may not be good bread, which is that's an aesthetic judgment as opposed to the basic nourishment. It's about how we perceive it. And the same would go for music. And I think there's a third factor, that there is performance, because we could have the same music and it could be music we like, but different people perform it differently, or the same ingredients in the kitchen to prepare the same dish, but 2 people would prepare it completely differently. And that's where the fascination comes in about the humanity of these common endeavors. So I think you and I are off to a very good conversation.
We don't have the food in front of us, which is a pity.
So if your parents recognize this talent and interest in you, you grew up in France, you said. How did you then study, and did an instrument speak to you? Were you given different instruments? How did that work?
Well, I think that my dad is a great artist, and he was a child prodigy. He did something like 1,000 oil paintings by the time he was 9.
Mm.
But it's funny because I'm told that when I announced that I wanted to be a musician at age 3, I was not taken seriously, really. And it's really because musicians are something very specific, that when you start very young. And my grandmother talked over the phone to my dad, and she said, "You should be ashamed of yourself. You are an artist. You should understand." but anyway, sort of. Then I just, for me, I started with piano and violin, but I almost sort of, I would say, I had 3 years to learn music that was already existing. And by the time I was 6, I could read a score and write in all the different clefs, and but it was quite natural, and I started to want to write. But I think that I never wrote because I liked writing or something like that, but because I wanted to be like Beethoven. For me, it was always an aspiration for greatness, for something that is what I talked before, so something that is more than myself. It's not, for me, music is not, I think, I know there is a romantic idea of music as expressing oneself, but I'm not a romantic in that sense. I think that I see music as a means to expressing something that is great and that is absolute and that is beautiful in some way. So I started music very young, age 3, and then it gradually grew. I learned to play an instrument, and through that to play very great music. But until I was in my late teens, I thought that I would do 2 careers, that I would be a soloist as a violinist and a composer. And even if I went to see Daniel Barenboim when I was 12 years old, and he told me, "Boy, that's not possible." And I thought, he's old, he doesn't know, he doesn't understand. And as you do. And I actually sort of, I think that, but he sort of, in a way, I was right, because I wouldn't be the composer that I am today if I had given up on playing when I was 12. Because the amount, I mean, even now, if you gave me a violin, I know by memory probably 20 violin concertos that I have not played for many, many, many years, but I know that my memory is the same. I know a lot of string quartet. I know symphonies by memory. I think that it's part, you create something because you love something that already exists, and you live through it. So, but it seems so far away. I'm a bit old now, and when you talk about being 10 years old or something like that, it starts to be even young. For my children, I've got a 21-year-old daughter, and I've got a 14 years old. So even they are already over that age of small children.
Yeah. I guess I don't agree with Daniel Barenboim. He's made a career as a conductor and as a pianist. So therefore, it is possible to be a performer and a conductor. Someone we will talk about soon, Vladimir
I think that, sort of
Ashkenazy.
sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
I think that he was right in some way. It's the difficulty of the time restriction. Sort of when I was 20, actually, in the real life of I was always frustrated that I was working 16 hours a day and it was never enough. I was either frustrated at not practicing enough or not writing enough. And even for the conducting, now I'm doing a lot more conducting. But for many years, I put it on the side because I didn't want to be like Mahler, that he wrote only during the summer. And that I thought it was not for me. I wanted to be able to write music all year through. But I think that there is a time for everything in life. And it's different when you're a bit older. But I think that had I chosen to do more conducting when I was in my 20s, first, I may not have the body of work that I've got, but even the quality of work, I'm not. But you cannot live your life twice on judge what would have happened. But it's my feeling that there's something true about that, but because just time is limited.
I want to educate the listeners who may not know that Gustav Mahler, who died pretty young, I think he was 50 or 51, I have to check that, worked very hard for 9 months of the year as a conductor, first in Vienna, then New York, and would then retire to mountainside or lakeside settings in Austria and northern Italy to compose in the summer. And I visited his 3 composing huts, one near Salzburg, one near Klagenfurt, and one near Bressanone Brixen in northern Italy, or near Belluno. And I always wonder how Mahler could suppress his composing instincts for 9 months of the year while conducting Wagner and Verdi and Beethoven and everything else he conducted, and Mahler, in the other 9 months of the year, and then bring it all out in the summer. And if he didn't finish, let's say, the 4th Symphony by the time he had to finish and go back to Vienna, he didn't finish. And my view of creativity is that when it visits you, when the muse visits you, you have to reply immediately. You have to put everything down and just do it. And it sounds like you compose when the muse visits you. You perhaps get up every day and focus on composing. Creative people, I know of all types, put themselves in front of their computer, in front of their kitchen stove, in front of wherever they stand to do their creativity every day, whatever comes. And Mahler, to me, is just remarkable for that he seemed not to, unless he somehow scratched out notes while in rehearsal or standing at the podium in Vienna or New York. I don't understand that. Do you understand how someone can suppress creativity for 9 months?
Yeah, completely. In that sense, sort of, I think that it's there's a because I make the difference between what we are as human beings and as creator. I think that it's not a good choice in terms of human suffering, but it doesn't. When I was in my 20s, you are not going, if you are a serious composer, someone that is moral in your composing, you're probably not going to make a lot of money either ever, or definitely not when you're young. Because actually, so I was talking to my dad the other day because there was a book that somebody offered to him, and he found that it was a book about a great collector, and he bought sort of some paintings from Picasso and various people when they were young, and actually he knew the man that bought paintings from him, and we found out that when he bought the paintings from Picasso, when Picasso was in his 50s, and we always think about Picasso as someone that really sold paintings for a lot of money, but when he was 50, it was pretty cheap, 50. Yeah. But he lived until he was 90 something. So same for a composer. But just to come back to the main subject, so I think that you've got to find a way. If you've got to, I always thought that I would write exactly what I wanted, and you couldn't buy me even. Not because I'm a great saint, because I think that sometimes you have more to lose by not doing what is right. So it's just as simple as that. And for me, it's too precious to, even if you gave me $1 million, I wouldn't write what I don't like it. And even when I was 20. And so I thought, how do I earn a living? So I was having decided that I didn't have enough time to perform. So I taught a lot, and I was teaching privately a lot. We are talking about maybe 30 hours of teaching, plus I was going to people, so we are talking about 50 hours a week. of teaching, and every single minute that I could use to compose, I was going to use. But I think that it's there's frustration in not being able to do something that you think is important to you and important in general. But the creativity, I don't feel it. It's not that suddenly the things flows out of me and I need to use it. Is if I don't compose for a few days, I become depressed a bit, and it happens even sort of sometimes. You know, if I've got if I've got lots of, there was a week, I think a few weeks ago, where I had in the same week 5 interviews, and I was preparing some score to conduct, and that week I decided I was not going to kill myself. So for that week I didn't compose at all, and I felt like my life was meaningless. And it's very and then I'm a pain. I would say that it's not good for my wife or people around. I try to be nice, but it's a human thing. It doesn't change the creativity in the long run. I think that Mahler must have decided that it was his only way. I don't think that he didn't suffer from it. But then, sort of, if you bottle it up for so many months, then of course by the time you arrive, it could be easier in some way. But it's I think it's not an easy life to do it. But there's no perfect life. But it's, having said that, it's one of these unusual situations. You know, like, but there are always unusual situations, like Chopin that wrote music only for piano, or you could say Scarlatti, or you could then someone like Wagner that wrote only for opera. And I say only for opera because for me, opera or piano, it's the same. It's one thing, which is rare because usually very great composers write for everything. But there's never a rule. People are different, and so. But in that sense, Mahler is very different.
Does your father paint every day?
Yes, he's over 80, and it's and I tell him that he's I think that I learned the most in terms of as an artist from my dad. He was my biggest teacher, and I learned not only because he's a very great artist, so I learned from his view on art, but also dedication and I would say, I mean, almost stoicism, but he's a very smiley person. And but you know, the idea that you need to work, that you need to really no excuses, and I've seen it, and I try to do that myself. So yes, I think that it's a discipline. It's a discipline. I think that Tolstoy was going to his room at a certain time every day. So if you, I tend to do the same, but because life of a musician is a bit different, it doesn't need to be the same time every day, but it tends to be the same amount of time. Sort of, it's really a lot of hours, and sometimes nothing is coming, or it's just total rubbish. But if you don't do the rubbish, you are not going to produce the good.
True. Hemingway, who had a very busy life, he drank, he had a lot of women, he was a public figure. But every morning at 5 or 6 in the morning, he would sit down and write, no matter what. And when he did whatever number of words he thought he wanted to do, usually 500, then he would put it away and do the rest of his life. And he was very disciplined in that way. I'm a great student of Michelangelo. I've studied him my whole life. And Michelangelo, for most of his life, would work Monday through Saturday. And he was somewhat religious, and he would not work on Sundays. But when he reached his 80s, he felt he still had more to do. And very late in his life, he died at almost 89. He was working on a sculpture, and he was not completing it. He was a very old man. He had been sick. He, on the last Sunday of his life, worked on the sculpture. He felt that God would forgive him, and that was what he had to do on that Sunday. He died a couple of days later. But to the very end, he was working and creating and extremely obsessed and extremely disciplined and extremely temperamental, like Beethoven in a way. But his social life was a mess. He was dirty. He didn't wash. Everything was devoted to getting up and doing what he felt God ordained him to do, which was to work on his art. And that he was a vessel for that. And there was nothing else. He wrote poetry. He did beautiful, unparalleled creative things. But like Beethoven, he was not socially adept. He was not connected. Beethoven, in Vienna, a lot of composers and musicians like to eat, and the food in Vienna is very good. And you'll understand this, that Beethoven said, nicht essen, nur fressen. I have to eat like an animal would eat to get the nutrition, the food in me to keep working. But he did not savor his food at all. He was a sloppy eater. He would walk around with food on his chest, on his shirt. And I find those figures fascinating. I don't think we want to be with them very often, but there are, let's call them the social and familiar requirements. If you're married and you have children, you have responsibilities there too. And all of that has to be structured. And I'm asking you this because I find it infinitely fascinating how musicians in our modern world, with all the distractions and all the requirements, many be more than 50 or 100 years ago, manage to structure their lives and summon their creativity enough to do what they do. And also, I mean, I've had 270 plus guests on this program, most of the musicians in one form or another. And I know that I've had to arrange for them to join me when their time permitted, if there were singers, when their voices permitted. And I have immense respect for that, because I believe at the end of the day, the end of our lives, that the way we've affected the world and perhaps improved it is by doing things that we morally understand to be right, but doing things for others, whether it's feeding them, whether it's educating them, whether it's taking care of their health, whether it's giving them comfort, whether it's giving them the insight that music can give them. And I see creativity as an act of giving, not an act of making, so to speak. And when I look at it that way, I find it even more admirable when creative people in all fields do what they do. The adversity is incredible. It's like a salmon who goes out to sea and gets its education and has a mate, and then comes back and comes up the river knowing that eventually it will be caught by the bear or by the fisherman, and that will be the end of its life. But it will have created everything on the life cycle, going out to sea, to the ocean, and coming back in again. And same thing, we're given time, we don't know how much, and it's what we do with that time and how we make it valuable that, to me, is part of why we're here, and frankly why I have such respect for composers, musicians of all type. I want to ask you a question. There are many things I want to ask you a question about, but one is, I know that as a composer, you have had an association with Vladimir Ashkenazy, who is someone that I've never discussed on this program, but who I'm connected to in a way that I'll explain after. But please talk about him from your point of view.
It's a funny thing, because when I was a child, I used to have all, not all, but all his recordings as a pianist. Especially, I loved Chopin Etudes recording. I had the recording when he played with Perlman, Beethoven piano sonatas, and other things, and you name them, sort of Rachmaninoff concertos, and then, but like a great performer. And when I was in my, I think, 30s, young 30s, beginning of 30s, I saw a program. I think he was talking, either it was on radio or TV, I can't remember. And they asked him about Shostakovich, I think. And he spoke a few things, and I thought, this man is going to really like my music and understand me. Just, I had a feeling, sort of, I just thought it's the way that he talks about what it is to be a composer and things like that. It's, And so I was 30. I had a bit of a career, but not a huge career. But so I wrote to his agent, expecting that I was just never going to go through because impossible, you know. And then the next day, I received an email from his agent saying that it was still sort of a modern time. So when I sent the things, I sent sort of some recordings via, I think that then it was MP3, but it was still, we were in the age of email still. And and the agent said that Ashkenazy was really interested. He was very, very busy, but he could meet me in 2 weeks when he was going to be in London, or 3 weeks. I can't really remember. And he could give me 5 minutes. 5 minutes this time. And I thought, okay, very important. So I prepared, I thought about what I could play. And I had this one of, you remember round CD players that you could put batteries and travel with?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and I thought, okay, so I put from the computer to the CD, one of these printable CD. I put some of my works on, and I went to Ashkenazy, and it was a rehearsal. It was at the end of a rehearsal. He was conducting the Philharmonia Orchestra. And it's really funny because the place where I met him the first time is a place he recorded the CD of my music. Which just, but anyway, so I went to see him, and I asked him, which I think is a really, really good question, and it's almost a test. As a composer, you ask the person when you bring something to play whether they want the score or something like that. So the conductor that says, "Oh, I can hear it all in my head. I don't need the thing." They are liars and they're not good musicians. They are useless, even because it's not like reading a book. Of course, you can hear music in your head, but you need time, not like sort of you would read a book. And so Ashkenazy said, no, I don't need the music, just play the CD. And then I play the 5 minutes, and he said, oh, it's really beautiful and things like that. And I said, thank you so much for your time. And he said, what, that's it? I said, well, it's your agent. He said, oh, come on, I've got time to listen to some more. So we played some music for about an hour and a half. And suddenly he looked at his watch and said, oh, I'm late, my wife, dinner, sort of, hotel, and whatever. But that was my first meeting with him. And he was, I always found that the man that I knew from my childhood, that I listened to the CDs and things like that, and the man that I know from knowing the man, are two different things that never met. Somehow it's a bizarre thing that you cannot connect the two. But he was a very, a very down-to-earth person, very generous with his time, and I had really very great relationship with him, and he helped sort of. I had career before he started to perform my music, but of course it gave it was a tremendous help when he started to conduct my music. And he intended to be like that. Every time that we met, we would meet, every time he was in London, so twice a year or something like that, we would meet for coffee, lunch, or something like that. And he would always tell me these terrible stories of what happened to composer. I don't know how he knew all these stories, but relentless. And he thought it was good for me to see that even if I was a great composer, if terrible things were going to happen, it was normal. But I would be out of these meetings really depressed, but I wouldn't want to tell him because I knew that he was doing it for a nice cause. But the stories, it's but things don't change that much. It's the human relationships are the difficulties for composers that are original will always be the same. And in some way, it's reassuring to see that you are not the first, but it's also depressing because you think, oh my God, it's going to continue maybe that way.
Yeah.
I think
well, it is true that most of the stories we know about most of the composers are pretty sad and pretty dire. Even someone who seemed to have success like Rossini was actually, he had venereal disease that he acquired at the age of 14. Now, that could sound pretty happy because how he got the disease, but he died at 76. And the reason that he moved to France from Italy is better medical care. And he had all of these medications that kept him going for decades and kept him writing. But Rossini, despite the sound of his music, was a depressive. And he stopped writing at a certain point and had salons twice a week because he felt he did what he could do as a musician. And then he became a benevolent musician and benefactor to others. And he had two salons a week in his home in France, one on Wednesday and one on Saturday. And I always forget, one of them was for the public and the other was for composers. And Rossini, due to all this medication, lost his hair very young. And he had 7 wigs. And he had a wall with 7 heads. And there was Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, a wig for each day that was slightly different. But and we think of his as a good life. He made a fortune in his money. Verdi had terrible challenges, but lived a long life and huge success. Almost all of the composers had Leonard Bernstein, who I knew, very challenging lives. And it seems to come with the territory. I'm concerned that twice you used the word depressed already. I don't want that to be your standard operating default. I don't think it is actually. You're more jovial
No,
than that. You're
no,
quite,
no.
I can tell you're quite jovial. Um, I'll tell you why I asked about Vladimir Ashkenazy, because I know he's now a man, but I know a fellow who I held as a newborn baby. And his father is Eric Asimov, the wine writer of the New York Times. His mother is one of my dearest friends. His mother's family was very musical. And I held this little boy, 3 or 4 days old. And I remember thinking, so what is this kid going to turn out to be? He has very accomplished parents. And by the time he was 3 or 4 or 5, he showed incredible musical talent. And his uncle knew Vladimir Ashkenazy. And Ashkenazy, when he was here in New York, would teach little Peter, was the boy's name. And Peter was a wonderful pianist as a child. He performed at festivals and Carnegie Hall and so on as a child. But his mother very carefully said, I'm not going to try to influence him to become the next Evgeny Kissin. We will let him do what he wants. If he wants to play baseball, if he breaks his fingers, that will be very upsetting, but I don't want to interfere. And young Peter Asimov grew up always in contact with Ashkenazy, moved to the UK. He studied at Oxford. He's now a professor at Cambridge, specializing in French music. You and he had the same scholarship. I don't know how to pronounce it. Leverhulme?
Mhm.
Leverhulme? Okay. You had it and he had it. And I'm wondering, and both, he was trained by Ashkenazy. We know who taught him piano. He had a piano teacher, but really the one who taught young Peter Asimov the piano was Vladimir Ashkenazy. We thought he might go on to a great career. His mother carefully said, we let him do what he wants. And he was drawn to academia. And now he is a professor at Cambridge, specializing in French music, which did not seem the direction he was doing, really more the dramatic repertoire. But his mother very wisely let him just do whatever his creativity and his interests led him to do. And have you ever met Peter Asimov? Because I think you have a lot in
No,
common. I'll
no.
introduce you. I will
Yes, please.
introduce you because you have Ashkenazi in common. You have the same scholarship in common. You both live in the UK, but you're not from the UK. So it will be interesting to see how that develops. Um, you were talking about, I guess what I want to know is, yes, you began writing music. What, I can't speak for all composers. I want you to speak for yourself, but I will say a composer. What does a composer hear? And what brings him or her to sit down and put on the score the notes that you put down? How does that happen?
Well, I can speak only for myself because you know
Yeah.
stuff. It's even if I think that my wife, she's a writer, but she also does translations, and she translated. She's Italian to Italian all the letters from Mozart. We are talking about thousands and thousands of pages over a few years. But she also recently translated a specialist book, musicology, about Bach. And from time to time, she would ask me, because she's not a musician, she understood right certain things, because it was very technical. And there were some things sort of where the musicologist gave two examples, the thing that Bach started with, and then what he changed it to. And it's exactly the way that I work. I was not aware, but you know, the change of rhythms to find a better rhythm, there is I could give you an example, or maybe it's not interesting, but it's I think that there are two different aspects. The first aspect is the technical aspect, that any composer has to be able to hear in his head the sound so that it can make them a little bit. There's this nice book by Suskind called Perfume, The Perfume, where where he mixes sort of aromas in his mind, and he doesn't need to do it. And I suppose a cook is the same. You can imagine different things that you've never mixed and imagine what it would be together. But if you don't have this technique, you cannot even start to be even a bad composer. Even to be a bad composer, the real thing about but I think that in some way there is a total enormous gap, unbridgeable gap between real great composers and others. And it's nothing to do, it is, I give, usually when I teach composition, and I tend to teach composition to musicians that are very good performers themselves and that are interested, but they are professionals. And I give my first lesson, I give the first page of the first piano sonata by Beethoven and the first page of the first piano sonata by Hummel. And I ask them why Hummel is not as good. And all the great composers are not symmetrical. And all the bad composers, never mind which century or whatever, are symmetrical and predictable, or you could call it academic in some way. And Hummel is not, I mean, you can go much lower than that. But that's the main thing. And I would think that, of course, you work on that. So the work that you do is you break the symmetry. And that's, I always think, you know, you take some of the greatest composers ever, and it doesn't matter who you think, whether it's Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, or whoever, and none of them can create only great masterpieces. Because that's unhuman, and no one can, even, you cannot, unless you decide to destroy everything else. But that's, it doesn't
like
count.
Michelangelo.
Yeah.
Michelangelo destroyed things. Yeah.
Yeah, but it doesn't change the fact that you created things that were not as good. You destroyed them. No, and I think that that's the thing that is the big mystery is what you do when you start with a white page. If you are a very great composer, on the first 20 seconds of the piece are special, the rest will be too. But the first 15 seconds of any piece, which is not necessarily what you started with, because sometimes you go backwards, but if the essence of that piece is magical, then the rest will be too. But that is totally, there are no tricks. That I think the trick is that there are no tricks. And that part comes. And you, of course, you work on the way that you work. I think that the real trick is to be able to identify what you don't like. I think, but it's again, I like to do lecture recitals, and I did one about music and the scientific method. And we did it, we shared it with the head of neuroscience of UCL, which is a big university in London. And he likes music as well. And we had a few coffees together and lunch to talk how, because my point was, what type of method you use when you compose. And it's very similar to the scientific method in the sense that you try to narrow down what you're testing. So let's say there is a passage that you wrote and you think it's not good, and you think, okay, maybe it's the rhythm. So then you try to change just the rhythm, but not something else. So it's like, in that, it's like the scientific method when you try to have the parameters quite clear. And then you can elaborate on that, and there are many commonality. But the first difference, and the biggest difference, is what makes you decide that it's not good. And in a way, this is the talent. That's a real talent, because if you really feel that something is not good and you are desperate, sort of life desperate to get to the thing that is good, you will try to find a way. But there is no amount of years that will it's sort of shortened sometimes your thinking, but not by much. I've got this because we are talking about Ashkenazy. The first time I wrote a piece for him as a conductor, it was, I think, maybe almost 20 years ago now, maybe 20 years ago, and I had this commission to write an overture, 10-minute piece for Ashkenazy and the Philharmonia Orchestra. And I knew that as a career thing, it was very important for me. So maximum pressure, even if as a man, I really don't care about these things in a big. I think that, as I say, sort of for me, it's what I live. But still, I am a human being, and I thought, okay, I must write the best that I can. And anyway, I start to write that piece, and I'm very inspired. And the beginning is really good, and then it's a 10-minute piece, and I write about 7 minutes. And I get completely stuck. I think that it's boring here. And I had a lot of experience by that point. And it took me, I just sort of, for a month, I was working every day for 8 hours or God knows how long, and nothing was moving. Until after about a month, I decided, okay, if I can't tell why it's bad, at least let's try to figure out from when it's bad. You know. Yeah. So, and I thought, okay, the first minute and a half are perfect. After that, something goes wrong. And it took me a while, and eventually, after about 5 weeks or something like that, I understood why I didn't understand. Because all was good, and that's why I couldn't find a fault, but it was too similar.
Yeah.
And so I decided, okay, everything that is after this 1.5 minutes goes in the bin. But luckily, I'm sort of obsessed of not being late. So I'm never late for anything. My wife would say that we arrived to the airport at a ridiculous time, but true for the composing as well. So I always take, if I know that I need about 200 hours to compose something, I would imagine 500 hours, so that I give myself a bit of a bumper zone to do that. So I eventually found the solution, but it's, even now, I've got even more experience, something like that, but I think that certain things are, you cannot explain them, because it's beyond explanation. It's easy to explain why things are bad in some way, and the things that are very great, they are very great because they are not bad. So, because there's nothing bad in them somehow. But it sounds stupid, but it's true, and there are no tricks. There are really no tricks, which doesn't mean that it's not that you cannot explain the things. For a few days ago, I had this concert where I was conducting a new piece of mine on some Elgar, and I told the orchestra we were playing the Elgar that to imagine, before they start to play, imagine that you are in a very, very hot day in a desert, sort of, it's, let's say, 40 degrees, and you feel really you can't breathe, and you don't have water, of course. And then sort of you arrive to this oasis, and there is this hotel. You come in and there's air conditioning and they give you a glass of water. And imagine the feel that you have when you drink that glass of water. That's the sound that I want. This type of well-being sound. But it's exactly, the piece has got this type of atmosphere that somehow you cannot, I think that's the best explanation rather than, sort of when people say, okay, that's a dominant, that's tonic, but who cares? It's a dominant or tonic. It's not that creates the magic. It's the contrast between things, and music is like a story without words, but a story. And if you don't find the true story, it might have variations, sort of many ways that you could interpret it, but in a way, if you understand the music well, what never changes, and that's not a point that a performer can decide, is at which point there is a change of mood. This is not debatable. It's like where you cannot change a comma in a place. There is a place on which that note, that the atmosphere changes on that note. How it changes, even if I conduct my own piece 3 days in a row, I will change the mood, but in this point, not that is the piece, because otherwise it's another piece. And it's true for any composition. This is objectively done.
Mm-hmm. When you are writing a piece, or a composer, but in this case you, and it has to be 10 minutes, you've done 7 minutes, and then you decide to remove a section that doesn't work for you, do you discard that music, or do you save it and it may get used again in the future?
You try to recycle it. It's true. You try to save it for the future. If it's good, yes.
Well, Rossini did that all the time.
Yeah,
and Donizetti, and what Verdi did, there's a wonderful expression in Italian, la musica di Verdi è come un maiale, non si butta mai niente. In other words, the music of Giuseppe Verdi is like a pig. You never throw anything away, and because you could use all the parts. And I think what it meant about Verdi is that everything was essential, and that if he cut something out, it's because he understood he was a great editor. What had to come out. Wagner was not necessarily a great editor. Mahler, we could question that, but I think that Verdi was the best editor of his own music. He understood what was essential and kept it. What do you do with the music that doesn't get into the work you're now working on?
It's it depends. Sometimes it's what I find is finding there's this beautiful phrase, in this film that we've all seen, Amadeus, where sort of Mozart answers that is exactly the right amount of note at the right place, which is for me what it is to compose, to find the absolute in that sense. But sometimes what I find when I compose is that the same material that I discard sometimes gets reintegrated, but a bit later in the piece. It just didn't belong to that moment. It's in the past 10 years, I would say it's very, very, very rare that I recycle material of one piece to another. But it has not always been like that. Some works I have found. I wrote them when I was 20-something, and there was something very magical about it, and great, but not fully great. And I retook them maybe 20 years later and did what Verdi, the editing. Sort of, I found sort of new ways, but at the moment it's not, I have nothing against it. It's just not happening to me. It tends to be that that it finds its way, that I find the solution inside the same piece, that it can move completely, or it can be reorganized differently. I'm a super contrapuntal composer, which means that there are lots of melodies going on at the same time, but many with different rhythms and things like that. And sometimes I just would add more melodies on top of it, and it changes the thing, but it tends to be used in the same piece. But it's not. I am not against doing something else. It's just I'm telling you what's happening at the moment.
No, I'm interested to know your process.
Yes.
We're both giving examples of other composers, but it's really about your process and your point of view. There are creative people, let's say composers for now, but you could say painters, sculptors, writers, maybe filmmakers, I don't know, choreographers, who start at the very beginning, so that, for example, a writer or a journalist would often try to find the lead, which is spelled L-E-D-E, not L-E-A-D, which is the germ of the idea, and it becomes the first sentence. And if in an article or a book, he or she writes that lead that crystallizes everything, then you're off and running. There are other creative people, Tchaikovsky being an example, who would always look for the emotional germ of the piece. So when he wrote the opera Eugene Onegin, he didn't write from the beginning using the libretto. He sketched out the letter aria of Tatiana. And when he felt that he understood her, everything grew out of that back to the beginning of the opera, toward the end of the opera. But the emotional core and the dramatic core was always the letter aria of Tatiana, which is the second scene of the first act. It's an opera in 7 scenes, so it's the second scene, I believe. And I don't have a preference one way or the other, but do you find that you start with a germ idea that has to come at the beginning, or you may have an idea that will be somewhere in the piece, and then you grow from that?
I think that even for Tchaikovsky, you will see that it depends on the piece. An opera is a slightly different problem because it's not totally abstract, so you can take the decision that you will work that way. But I think that for me, music is something that grows in time. So I tend to, by decision, try to start from the start and then grow as it goes and find the perfection in that way. But it's a decision, but what actually happens, it's not always that. So I'm starting by what I think is the beginning, and sometimes I find that the first 1 minute of music that I write is not maybe that great, and then after 1 minute comes the real thing, and then I throw away all the 1 minute of music that I wrote, take that, and then sometimes, when it's a pieces that I wrote a long time ago, I cannot remember because the result is the same. Whether, let's say that you've got, give you again an example of not my music because everybody will know it, Beethoven Violin Concerto. So it starts with the pam, 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 and the da, dee, da, da. So, of course, without the first bar, the next beat doesn't work as well. But it's a typical type of thing that you can, as a composer, either come with the idea that you start with something that is very short, and then you are going to have something that is long, or you compose the thing that is long, and you know that you need to go backwards to create the short. 20 years after, you don't know what you've done. That's what I call the little introduction. So like sort of before the curtain open. But because it comes to the same, what is important there is the idea of that this little thing is bringing something. It's and whether you found the something and you went back to find how to bring it, or you found the thing that was going to bring the great thing and then you find the great things. I think it has got no. It will depend on the piece, even if. But I think that that any great art is has to feel like there was no other possibility. And in that sense, that's also a big difference between the great composers and the others, is that the idea that you have a form and that inside that form you put things, it's the idea of bad composers. No one will do it like that. It doesn't mean that the form doesn't exist, but it grows organically and by a need of the writers, they tend to say that they have their characters in the book, and then the characters decide what they want to do.
Yes.
And I feel a bit like that with the note, even if it's abstract with the note, but somehow you've got an idea. You need to have an idea of where you want to go, because otherwise you can't start your journey. But then sometimes you change your mind, because where you thought you needed to go is not actually where you need to go. But I tend to be quite good about, I say that and then it's going to haunt me and I'm going to have problems later, but about judging type of length of, when people commission me a piece, they always ask, what do they need to tell me? And I say, they can't tell me how to style or anything. I write my music. If they like my music, I'm going to write what I like. But I need to know instrumentation and timing, because if you start a novel that is 500 pages, it's not like the same as starting a novel that is 100 pages. So the same for me, if the piece is 30 minutes or if the piece is 10 minutes, it's not the same thing. But inside that, for example, you take a concerto. Now I've had that happen twice to me. When I wrote my violin concerto, I thought it was going to be in 3 movements. And it ended up being in 4, because when I was writing the second movement, which I thought was going to be the slow movement, I thought it was going to be a first movement that was fast, and then you would have a slow-ish middle movement and a very fast last movement. Well, in some way quite classical in that, but I don't think that it's classical. It's because there are not that many things that you can change, in that sense. But when I finished writing the second movement, I felt somehow that the second movement was slower than the first one, but it was still quite like a romance type of thing. It was not slow. So I thought, I cannot go I need a really slow movement, and I don't want to end with a slow movement. So it became 4. And in the same way, before I started to write this third movement that would precede the fourth, I thought to myself, okay, now I want one of these movements that is like like the Mozart piano concerto, where it's few notes and it's out of this world, on beauty that is God, beauty, this type of things. And then I wrote one of the most darker movements that I ever wrote, that felt like Waiting for Godot, where the time stops, but it's so dramatic. But in a way, it plays the same role. It's very slow and still, so that it creates something that was needed there before the last movement. But what I thought that I needed was not what I needed, and what I needed came.
So, like all composers I speak to and conductors, you anticipated about 5 questions that came to my mind while you were talking. I'm going to bring up a couple of them. Don't apologize. That's a good thing. One is whether you particularly, or composers in general, seem to feel the need to either embrace a traditional form, such as a symphony in 4 movements, a concerto in 3 movements, with the middle movement being a slower movement, the Mozart piano concerto being, to me, the best example, that the first and third movements are beautiful, but it's the second movement that always steals my heart, because that's where he emotes to me. Or whether the composer wants to break through those forms and do something different, either just to be different, or, as you just expressed, because you heard the need for more, for another movement.
But for me, so to answer your question, I think that it's the most important thing for any great artist is novelty. And so it's very important, but novelty is often misunderstood. So people sort of, if to take sort of something it's very funny. In contemporary music, for a while, people thought that you were novel if you compose something for 12 trombone, 1 clarinet, and maybe a shoe. And that was a novelty. But after you've done it once, it's not novel. If you do it, it's like in painting for Duchamp with his toilet. If you do, you replace the toilet with, I don't know, a bag. 20 years later, it's the same thing. It's not novel. So it becomes totally academic and not new. It's a pseudo-new. And this is not really creative. apart from the fact whether it's good in itself or not, but if it's not new, it cannot be good. But the new, what is new, it can be, you can decide, okay, what is new is in a way the structure. So you decide that you are going to do a concerto that lasts 30 minutes, no stop.
Yeah.
First, the problem is to know whether it works or not. It's an interesting idea. In my opinion, it doesn't. Because it's the only forms that tend to, in music, to work or for that length of time tend to have a visual aspect. So it's like opera or ballet or something like that. And even then, they are cut in lots of small beats. But 20 minutes of non-stop music, it's a long, because it feels much longer than that. It feels like hours. But for me, there are two aspects. So the aspect of that I always wanted to write something that was completely new. You might have read in interviews, or I don't know if you Googled me or something like that, that I say, when I was 8-year-old and I had composed for 2 years, I thought that I invented 12-tone music because I did not know Schoenberg. And I was looking for something new. And at that time, the most new composers that I knew were Stravinsky, Shostakovich, Prokofiev. And somehow I found the 12-tone system without anyone telling me. It means that somehow it was in the... but as soon as I was told that somebody had done it before me, I was really upset. But but I think that there's another aspect. There's the aspect of doing something that is really new, but also I truly believe in that you can compare things, and there are things that are better. I am not a relativist, and so to measure myself into my gods and thinking I can do as well as better or something like that is important to me. Like in a concert, if a piece by a very great composer is played before my piece and my piece can stand after that, that's what I'm looking for. And so, but after that, you give it names. For me, whether it's a symphony or a concerto, the sonata, the concerto, the symphony are basically names that we give to a melting pot of things that are pieces that are in several movements, but not too many movements, because if they start to be 8 movements, they are more like suites type of things. So it's a very, very abstract, it's not anymore a form, it's more a concept. So, and concepts are more open, they don't make you sort of a certain time, because if there were a concerto for 3 centuries by composers that are very different, it means that it's just a name that we put on something. The things that are more specific are more difficult. For me, for example, I noticed, because of doing program notes when I was in my late 30s, that I often had to do program notes about pieces of one movement, which is unusual. But I was not aware that I was writing a lot of one movement pieces that felt much longer. And also, for example, I don't think that names are important. But I think that it would be...
That was another question I was going to, yeah.
But I'm not going to name piece number 1, piece number 2, because that is really, truly boring. So I have got all these I've got all these pieces that are one movement. And if you have one movement, you've got to give it a name. If it's a concerto, you just call it concerto. And that's it. You get concerto number 1, number 2, you are sorted. It's basically a piece for soloists with several movements. You add it. You write one movement, you need to give it a title. And then for me, the most important is that the title doesn't lead you to the wrong thinking. So it's almost, I'm always very troubled by finding the title. And my wife said that I always say that, and I find good titles, and she's a writer. But for me, at the end of the day, sometimes, I've got a really good musical memory, so I can very quickly know entire symphonies by memory. But names or words, I'm hopeless. And sometimes I have an interview and people talk about one of my pieces, and I can't remember the name, but I could write you all the notes, which shows how important it is. I mean, it's important in a way of communicating, because we need to know what we are talking about. But for me, beyond that, Not really.
Well, part of why I'm asking is the following, that I teach music, and so many people I meet, even if they're very open to all kinds of things, tend to have decided ahead of time before I've played the piece how they feel about it. If they like the composer, they will like the piece more. If they don't care for that composer, they'll say, well, it's Brahms, it's Schubert, it's whoever they may not, Debussy, great composers, all of them. But if they don't like Schubert, Brahms, Debussy, then they don't like it as much as Beethoven, let's say. So that's problem number one. Number two, if the symphony, if the work has a name, Pathetique, heroic, whatever it is, Requiem, Pastoral, people immediately categorize the piece by the name. Then, if critics and writers and scholars through history have said, well, that piece by Saint-Saëns is not his greatest, and middlebrow Saint-Saëns is really nothing to care about, means that before I play that piece by Saint-Saëns, we've already established all kinds of prejudices, positive or negative. And I try to put on a piece of music or play the piece of music so that there's no prejudice involved at all. I'll just say, here is some music. I wouldn't even say it's a bassoon concerto, whatever it is. I don't say, here's some music. Let's talk about it. We play the music and then we talk about it. And I think because in our society, and not only, but certainly now, people feel they have to understand everything and give definition to and analyze things, when what we have to open is the emotional side without analysis, without prejudice. That's the way into music. And you were saying earlier that a lot of music that people write has a story. Now, it may not be a story that we can tell like Romeo and Juliet, or two children walking in the woods because they're hungry, or whatever the story is. And when a composer or a publisher attaches a name to it, that limits the piece, unless the composer very specifically wants to tell, like Tchaikovsky, the story of Romeo and Juliet. And then we know from the beginning that that's what he was doing. It's very hard for when you write a piece and then it goes out in the world, you created it, but it's not yours anymore, so to speak. It belongs to everyone who hears it and comes to understand it and describes it. And I'm always very troubled by that, because some of the music I most love is music that has been dismissed as secondary because it was not Wagner's greatest movement, or act, or it was not Chopin's most lyrical or most dramatic or most pathetic. So what? If it speaks to me, I don't have to define for someone else how and why it speaks to me, but it just does. And I think that if we bring people to music and music to people, we have to do it without the scholarship, despite our inclination. We may be trained, but we just have to hand the music over as music and let people receive it as they receive it. And then if they want to do the musicological investigation, they can. Yeah.
I think that I agree and disagree with you. I think that I think that it's a matter of terminology. I think that you are in a time that is not intellectual enough and pretends to be, which is sort of the real problem is the lack of. I never think that you can that the emotion and the intellect are two different things. But I think that when you, it's why earlier when I was talking about my dad, I said it was my greatest teacher because he's an artist, so not academic. I've got a really the academism is to look at very, very small things that are minor and explains them like they are the secret of the real thing. But it's not that the real thing hasn't got secrets, and to really enjoy even more the work, you need to see what's in there. So not in the sense of understanding, but seeing, because you can, for example, I always loved tennis, but when I was young, we didn't have very much money, and there was no way that my parents could give me some private music lessons on also tennis. That was just, my dad is an artist, no way. So I learned tennis by myself, and I played with friends and always played tennis. But when I was older, I started to take some tennis lesson. And when you start to take the lesson and you learn the things, so when you watch other people, you see more. So you see more, so you enjoy more. It's not that you know what's right or not right, wrong, it's that suddenly you see more. It's that sense that this is, I think, is important. So the big problem is when it's really funny, and I see it a lot, where there's a big difference between performers, musicians that are performers, and composers. Composers are closer in a way to writers or artists than performers. They are like actors. So it's normal they don't have the same problems, and they don't perceive it in the same way. But if they've been to academies and something like that, sometimes they will tell you, like we take one of my works, and then the pianist will say, oh, that's like a dominant and it goes to the tonic. And I've in my life would not think like that personally. And like it's helped him to solve something, but it doesn't solve anything. So what? But the real questions that are really there is why are things there? And they are always to do with contrast and length and change of mood, on how you change the mood, on why is this mood there. But it's not, you can really, because the changes that you make have a reason. So for example, because I didn't give the example earlier about Bach, you take the well-tempered clavier. One of the first fugues does go ta da da dam pa da 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 da. When Bach wrote it first, he wrote it pa da da dam pa da da da. So without the dot, so it goes pam pa pa pam instead of pam pa pa pam. Now, I've read a couple of books on musicology on that. And the musicologist doesn't answer the reason why he said Bach has done that and that, but he doesn't answer the reason why he's done it, which is for me is obvious as a composer. Mm-hmm. If you do without the dot, you do pa da 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 da. It's, as I said before, it's symmetrical. You have a feel like pam pa pa pam pa pa pam pa pa pam, and it's boring, not good enough for Bach. If you do the dot, suddenly you move the weight, so you do da 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 da, and the note that becomes important moves forward and is the long note, because you see, pa da 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 pa da 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 da, and it somehow makes it go there, and that's why this rhythm is important. In my music, I got some almost trademark rhythm. My music is complex really quickly. And I like to put this, if people that listen are not musicians, but it's still sort of, I think that everything that is clear can be explained in a simple way. So if you take 4 dotted quavers, each of them is 3/4 of a beat. So together they make 3 beats. If you put it in a 4 beats time bar, you can do 4 of them that will make 4 times 3/4, and then you have one that is longer. Now, the one that is longer, because it's slightly longer, feel suspended and leads somewhere. So you do pam, 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 pam. It's like a big announcement of what's coming next. Pam, 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 and then pam. Now, whether you have it as something that becomes louder, like pam, 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 and then pam, or something that becomes softer, like pam, 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 there is a rationale to it. And if you don't understand this rationale when you're playing it, you can't play it right. Maybe the listener doesn't need to know that, but he will feel it if it's played correctly. Because it's and it's just so the stories are not stories like you know, like in literature. It's just I meant story in the fact that it goes through time. My dad says always that there's a big difference between music and or theater and painting. Is that the painting you see the result in one go, and then you can travel inside the painting with your eyes, but you still see the full thing that in music you never do, because it's impossible. It goes through time. And so it's in that sense that it's a journey. It's a different art.
I'm picking up on the tennis. One of the things that I love as someone who works in this field is watching creative people, in this case musicians, but it could be actors or dancers, rehearse. And I'm guessing it was 1997 or 1998. I was working in London in late June. The weather was unpredictable. There were rainy days and beautiful days. And I had the opportunity to go to Wimbledon, where I'd never been. And I was supposed to go to a match, but I arrived earlier because I wanted to get the feeling of Wimbledon. I'm not a big tennis. I like tennis. That's not my big sport, but I like it. And in the morning, I was walking around, and there are smaller courts, not center court, where players practice. And often they have a non-professional, they have someone to practice with. And because I really did not know the sport enough to know people by their faces, I remember walking past a court, and there was this magnificent woman who was playing so gorgeously in practice. And the beauty, the focus, the precision, the accuracy, the focus on every single thing she did was amazing to me. And then I walked to another court, and there was this very handsome, well-built guy who a few people sort of respectfully looked at, but no one spoke. And his movement in rehearsal, in practice, was like ballet. It was the most gorgeous movement I'd ever seen. It was only later I learned that I had seen Martina Navratilova and Roger Federer practicing. And I will say that them practicing was more compelling tennis to me than an actual match. And now I've seen several in New York and Paris and London, elsewhere. But and yes, I love the matches and the competitive aspects. But what I frankly loved more was watching them practice and rehearse on their own, and developing their skill and fine-tuning their art. So my question is, for you as a musician and for any colleagues you can think of that you want to talk about, the phenomenon of rehearsal as opposed to performance, and what happens in rehearsal.
I think that for me, you know, some people say that about art my dad used to tell me about about artists, and that a lot of the painters that are not good say that they enjoy the process. And great artists don't. They care only about the result. I mean, if you can do it in 1 hour, very good. If you do it in 10, or you do it in 20 years, or after, what does it matter? You want to get to the result. And I think the same for in composing. Now, I think that you should cut. There are two categories of rehearsals. The categories that are in a way similar to composing, in the sense that there's no money involved. So a string quartet or a pianist rehearse, he can rehearse 10 hours, 20 hours, 30 hours, and there's no limit because no money is involved. You can do more. And that is a certain type of rehearsal. a rehearsal with an orchestra is a different kettle of fish, because the problem is that you have, well, let's say there are 50 people and you need to pay them for their time because they're professionals, they need to eat. It costs a fortune to rehearse a few hours with 50 people if you need to pay, even if you pay $300 for each person for a day. I mean, imagine how much it is for a full orchestra. You get to the $15,000 easily, and that's for a day of rehearsal, which means that the time is limited, and it's almost the opposite of what you do in a purely creative art, where you'll spend the thing, you'll bleed yourself until you have the perfection. As a conductor, you have a certain time that is given, and you've got to use it the best that you can. And so, for me, the rehearsal is I know what I want ideally, but if you give me an orchestra that I can rehearse for 2 weeks, after 2 weeks, I still could say more things and I could work more in details, because for me, as I'm a composer, I know a lot of things that I want. It's not that I'm going to, but I have 2 days of rehearsals and I have to get to the essence. But if you do the essence and you construct the main thing very strongly, which means that, but even in rehearsal, I give myself like it was a concert totally, because otherwise there is no point. You're not working actually. But in concert, then you want to obtain the 100%. And I think that when we are talking about technique these days, I mean these days by the past 50 years, we are making a big mistake. Making something that hasn't got mistakes is the opposite of technique. That's just not making mistake. Technique is a capacity of producing certain type of sounds, not putting the right notes or the right rhythm. It's a certain, so creating the magic of things. And there are 2 ways that you can, when you are on stage and you give a concert, you can either go for having all the right notes and in the right time, and then you are sure that you have killed music, because it's not possible to do it without killing music, or you can make sure there are no musical mistakes. But it's a decision that whatever you do, you'll rather kill yourself than make musical mistakes. And actually, so, when people said, Rubinstein made a lot of piano mistakes.
I was about to bring that up.
But he never makes, you go to concerts these days, and sometimes you have pianists that makes very, very few mistakes, but they make them, when there is a mistake of note, they make in a place where Rubinstein would never make that mistake, because the main melody will never have mistake, because he concentrates so much on what is essential that sometimes there's something that is gone wrong in the background. But the essence of things, the thing that is the most important, will be spotless, even in terms of the right notes. There won't be mistakes there, and not mistakes of feel. And so when you conduct an orchestra, you do all of your maximum in the rehearsal so that it's spotless in terms of, because especially you want the notes to be right and everything to be right. But when you conduct, you want the essential thing, the thing that without them, in a way, what the story to follow. I think that in music, it's a little bit like when we live in a world that has got 3 dimensions and not 2. So you got the main melody that you follow from one place, that I would say it's the foreground. And then you've got different types of backgrounds that are, if by you bring to the foreground something that should be in the background, that's a musical mistake. Mm-hmm. That should never happen. But you are not, when you're a conductor, you are not an octopus. So you don't have 8 hands, but in your mind, if you are a good conductor, you might have 8 hands to give, but you can't do it physically, and you've got to follow the thing that is musical. And if something happens that is not, but because you didn't give the entrance to the horn, it didn't come in or something like that, tough, but the important things happened. So the thing that without it, you might as well not do music.
So you inspire many thoughts in my head. One of them that just popped in is the following. There are 88 keys on a piano, and an octopus has 8 hands, and could probably play octaves better than anyone else.
You
So
all wish you were there.
I want you to find a commission to find an amusing chanson-like piano piece of octet for octopus or on the octaves. It's there. It's something you take this and run with it. It's something to work with as a charming pièce d'occasion, occasional piece. But the other thing was, my father, who was a trombonist, adored Arthur Rubinstein and played him all the time, the recordings at home. So I grew up, I heard all the great pianists and so on, but somehow the one that was held up to me as the model was Arthur Rubinstein. And the first musical memoirs I ever read were the 2 volumes by Rubinstein, My Early Years, My Later Years. And I'm paraphrasing, but he said, I know that I've been accused of hitting a lot of wrong notes, but how many good notes there were too. And I got the point, because perfectionism has its virtues in a way. I would say that in my work, I aspire to being perfect, but know that I will almost never achieve that. On the 2 or 3 occasions in my life when I think I did, very good, but it's a good standard to aspire to. But there's also, you said, and I loved it, I wrote it down, I wrote it quickly. I never think that emotion and intellect can be separated as 2 different things. And yeah, I mean, I get that. I think they can be separated, because sometimes something is purely emotional with no analysis going on at all. When I hear the second movement of Mozart's Piano Concerto 23 K488, it is completely emotional for me. It just is. And I could try to understand why I'm moved, but there's something about that music that just moves me so much that I don't want to try to understand. I just want to allow myself to be completely transported, not because it's Mozart, not because it's the piano, not because of any reason that I could analyze, but very simply because that music, the first time I heard it, I didn't know who wrote it because I heard it in a film, completely sweeps me away. And I believe it's very important to, especially now in modern times, to allow room for emotion that is not hatred, that's not political emotion, that's all the negativity and vitriol that can be brought to the public place, but simply the kind of emotion that allows us to be free from all of that vitriol and hatred. And that's something that music and good cooking can almost uniquely do. If you're in front of a beautiful omelet, I'm not about fancy food where we analyze it, but just a perfectly made omelet, or a vegetable or a piece of fruit at its peak, that it's raw and you're just eating the piece of fruit. You understand this is what that cherry is supposed to taste like in May. And when you've had that cherry and you know what everything a cherry can be, you may not get it again, but you admire it in the moment. Same if you hear music that moves you. If you hear a chord progression that just strikes right at your heart, that's a gift, and does not have to be, intellect does not have to be brought into the occasion.
But I think that the intellect cannot answer the question, cannot explain the beauty, because it's beyond intellect. That type of beauty, even when you create it yourself, the difference between the composer and the person that listens is that the composer has done it, and he knows how he's done it, but he doesn't know why this is doing that. Yeah. In a way, when you finish composing the piece, it's why for me, you know, I was conducting just a few days ago, and someone asked me after the concert, because there was a premiere, so it must be really special to to bring this piece that you just wrote to the world. And for me, conducting the other composer or my piece, by the time it's written, it doesn't make any difference. It's just another music that I like, but I like it not because I did it. I like it because it's a. But if you, I'm less. I think that we should not forget, because I think that music is pure and art is pure, so it should never be used for something. For example, music is not good because it makes people nicer, or and first, it's not true, because if you think about it, one of the most cultured country ever, Germany, produced Nazis, and my wife has written a novel that has this part, and the Nazis were listening to great music even in the concentration camp, putting people to death and admiring Schubert. There are some cases where they would put to death some Jews in the camps, and then there was Jews that played for the Auschwitz Orchestra, and they would ask one of them to come and play a Schubert quartet in the evening. During the quartet, they would treat him like a human being, and after that, they could kill him. Or, and so I think that thinking that music will help humanity is a mistake. First, it's a mistake because it's not true. But also, even if it was true, to be used in a way, what is the beauty of art is that it's beyond necessity. You don't do it for money, you don't do it for goodness, you don't do it for anything. You do it for itself. It's not, it doesn't go to rule because of. It's just, it's what is beautiful about it. That is, it's not, nothing can bite, nothing. It's a certain of purity, which can have maybe this type of. Maybe it can have a good result on human beings. Maybe yes, maybe no. But Wagner was a horrible human being, and some composers were great human beings that were not lesser composers or not better composers. Who knows? Sort of, I think that as human beings, we respect people, but these days we try to mix things. It's because it's because we don't like the lack of comfort. But life is terrible. It's truly terrible, and there are all these things that are incomprehensible. Totally, that are, if you think about them a lot, it's tragic that it's like that, but it's there. So no, I think that for me, I think it's it's like I say, it's absolute. The beauty is the absolute on the fact that it's not because that I like about art, and also the fact that it is true. It's purely felt, like you say. It's something that we feel, but it's it's like all these questions that human beings ask all the time, and we will never have the answers, but we should ask the questions. So that trying to understand music in an intellectual way doesn't mean that we will, because I think that if it's good music, we will not. Like we can't have an explanation of why are we here, or it's this type of eternal questions that we can't answer. But if we don't ask them, we become poorer.
Yep. A placeholder, two placeholders. One is for people interested in Arthur Rubinstein. In 2021, I had his son, John Rubinstein, on as my guest. And he's a wonderful actor. I don't know if you know him. He's a wonderful actor. And he's done one-man shows. He's a very fine actor. And he was the youngest child, I believe, of Arthur Rubinstein, when Rubinstein already was quite an older man. And we spoke about his father as part of the conversation. So people just go to YouTube and enter Fred Plotkin, John Rubinstein, you'll find that. The second thing is, you were talking about music being made in the camps, concentration camps. Very famously, Theresienstadt, or Terezin in Czech Republic, was sort of the model camp where musicians were invited and they had orchestras, and there were women. There's a book called In Memory's Kitchen, and these were middle-class Jewish women from Prague who tried to recreate the memories of their social lives and their coffee clutches and their traditions. With the absence of all of this stuff, they would use potato peels in place of cake and so on. And there's a wonderful book called In Memory's Kitchen, edited by someone named Cara da Silva, who I knew, that is the classic of the form, where people who don't get it say, well, this is not a good cookbook. I can't cook anything from that. But people who understand about the phenomenon of culture, existing culture in the horrible context of concentration camps, and how 1 minute they are indulged this and the second moment they're put to death. I completely hear and understand and agree with you about what you just said. But I also believe that there is the moment, we recently, the Metropolitan Opera had Beethoven's Fidelio, and there's something ennobling about the sound of that music, even if you don't know the story, that you can just hear the Beethoven's either Leonore Overture or Overture number 3. It's called the Fidelio Overture, or Overture number 3 by Leonora. Unto itself, the spirit rises, and there's something ennobling about it, even if you have no idea what the inspiration is. And I think that that can happen. Maybe not the kind of deep emotional affect that I get from Mozart's 23rd Piano Concerto, second movement, but each one of us has these things within us. And I just believe that in life, in our contemporary life, it's important to create space for the emotions. And I don't see people doing that. They have reactions, they have aggressions, they have, what a cute dog. That's a nice reaction. It's not always a negative reaction, but emotion is different from reaction. And when we close off our emotional side to ourselves, not to others, we are poorer for that and sicker. I think it's a health issue as much as anything else. And I've taken care of a lot of people who are very old or have dementias and so on. And I always find that allowing music and allowing food to activate the pleasure aspect of their lives, when they may not understand much else at this point, is crucial. And I think, therefore, music can have the effect. And I know, and I agree what you're saying about music being made by horrible people. But if, in my case, there's a passage in Act 2 of Tannhäuser, not the famous parts, but an intermediate part with orchestra and 2 singers, that's just so deeply moving to me as music, that when I go to Tannhäuser, yes, there are all the great moments, but I also look forward to that moment because of the way Wagner's notes were put together. So I have a million questions for you, but we're going to have to do this in several parts. But I know that you have a recording of some of your new music coming up in late July of this year, 2025. And we're talking about rehearsals, about performance, and so on. Recording is a different thing, I believe. You correct me if you think I'm wrong, in that you're creating a document of a work that someone will hear when he or she hears it, whether on a CD, whether in a stream, on a adagio, in whatever format it's received, or perhaps later in live performance. But the creation of music in recording must be different. And if you think it is, how is it different?
I'm going to be difficult because I'm going to say that for me it's not.
Okay.
I think that it is in many cases these days, but it shouldn't be. And I make sure that for myself it's not. I think that it's. I understand the recording. For example, you take someone like, if I understand well what he said, if I remember well, Jascha Heifetz, a great violinist, he thought there shouldn't be mistakes in a recording because in a concert you play and it's once, but if you have the recording and it comes back every time, you anticipate the mistake, so it disturbs, which is true in some way. And of course, in the recording, you try to avoid the mistakes of notes or something like that, because they are. But what you really want to avoid is the mistakes of not having the. So for me, I treat the recording like having a concert, but where you were able to correct the mistakes. But I play it as a concert. It's not. I don't. To be honest, I don't treat rehearsal, concert, or recording as something different. When I'm in the music, I'm in the music 100%, and I'm not outside the music. I think it's like when you see a great actor, you see, and he's acting, let's say, Hamlet. He's not acting Hamlet. He is Hamlet. It's just when you cannot be outside, and so I think that and that because otherwise you are not producing anything at all. So you have to be wise with your time. But at the end of the day, if you what you want is that whatever you do, whatever you, let's say that you've got, for example, this recording that I'm doing, we're doing 15 hours for 3 pieces that are each like a concerto, about 20 minutes long. So we are doing my my mandolin concerto, which is about 20 minutes, my oboe concerto, 20 minutes, and the Shakespeare sonnets that I've already done in concerts, which is also, even if it's 5 sonnets, it's about 20 minutes as well. So 5 hours for 20 minutes of music. For people that are not musicians, it seems like a lot, but it's very little. It's very, very little. But in a way, let's say that my aim is that maybe the first hour, it's just to build up the thing so that we can eventually record something that is good. But the next 4 hours, I would say, is playing a lot of concerts where everything is intense, on every note is a matter of life and death, and hoping that by doing that, by cross-referencing, the mistakes will not be in the same place. But and if you got a good help in the back of the studio, because you are the person that you're recording, you tell them, okay, he will tell you, actually the bar 89, you never got it right in terms of notes, and that's what I need, because for the music, I think that for the music it needs to be right every single time in some way. But after that, when you do the editing of the CD, that for my piano concerto, when I recorded, I asked for, actually I was lucky in that recording, I was given all the things and I did the editing myself. It took 200 hours. And I said that my main point for doing it was that what I'm looking for is not the bits that are without mistakes. I'm looking for the magical moments. On the text that I've got the magical moments, these moments, I want them in. And we've got to find a certain way. And because you don't always conduct the same, so the speed is not always the same. So you cannot, sometimes 2 things are beautiful, but they would not go one after the other. Again, the idea of story. And actually, I learned that from Ashkenazy when he recorded my music 10 years ago or something like that. I remember that the sound engineer wanting him to do chunks of, let's say, 30 seconds or 1 minute, and he just flatly said no. I don't do that. And because he was Ashkenazy on that, so people did what he wanted, even if they were not convinced. But he said, I'm playing from the beginning to the end. I'll do it 7 times, but I cannot do chunks. And I totally agree. Up to a certain point, you can maybe do. I find that I can do maybe 2 minutes or 3 minutes of music, but I'm not going to do I've done it because you are just, when the technician asked me, oh, could we do again this bar, something like that, I did it to be polite, but at the end of the day, these bars that we did, just these bars, were hopeless, and we couldn't use them because they didn't live. I'm not a machine. Even if it's my music, I know every single note, but I cannot cry on demand or feel the cry. I can, like a good actor, you can cry on demand, but feel the thing, you cannot. It has to, the piece has a life, and you feel it as it grows, sort of. So I think that the recording, the aspect for me, there's something that may be a little bit different from a performance that is not a composer, that I'm very aware that I'm leaving something that will be something that people can come back in when I'm dead, like yes, a template of what I think my music should sound like. So that is something that is important to me. That's why I am doing more and more conducting, because I think that through my experience, I mean, for certain things like piano music, I had hundreds and hundreds of pianists playing my pieces. And I find that the most difficult thing to pass on is, in a way, the essential thing. The thing that is not on the page. It is on the page in a way, but that sometimes people miss it. It's there. It's the note, because the composer writes the note, the rhythm. It's all there, but in a way, the shared history. You know, like you had people that said that such pianist was a pupil of Brahms. That was then he taught some people that were pupils of Brahms, and then it gets passed on. But we have an advantage in our century. We can record. We can pass on more than just people that have been taught by, but I can leave recording, and I think that even recordings, and I think that videos are also a plus, because they give something else of the personal. I mean, whether you like it or not, we are human beings, and we express something on sort of. If we can see it visually, it's good. It's especially for in 100 years' time, 200 years' time, we have this very special thing that we never had apart from, I mean, now it's just a century that we have it, or not, yeah.
Well, as we conclude, I want to point out to listeners something that they know, that I asked most of my guests to provide me with a list of a few recordings from the Adagio catalog that inspires them. And you told me that you don't listen so much to recordings now as you did in the past when you were growing up and learning music, so that the items that you mentioned to me are mostly very mainstream, not bad, they're wonderful. Bach Concerto for Two Violins and Orchestra, Yehudi Menuhin, George Enescu, Pierre Monteux conducting, Mozart String Quartet with a wonderful lineup starting with Jascha Heifetz, the Beethoven Piano Sonata No. 8 in C minor, the Pathetique, played by Vladimir Horowitz, Beethoven Symphony No. 5, conducted by Wilhelm Furtwängler, and Sergei Prokofiev's Violin Concerto No. 1 in D major, played by David Oistrakh, in the USSR TV and Radio Symphony with Kirill Kondratian conducting. I'm just going to ask you about the most obvious of all, the Beethoven Symphony No. 5, Furtwängler conducting, Berlin Philharmonic. Yes, that's an example, I think, where the composer began at the beginning, ba-ba-ba-bum, and was off from that. Why this? I understand why this most famous of symphonies, but why this recording of Furtwängler and the Berliners?
Because I think that when you ask me to choose 5 recordings, I saw that for me, in a way, the pieces by themselves needed to be amongst the one that I consider in the first rank, because 5 is very little. But it was not enough for even that, because there are lots of composers that I like that I didn't put there. But I also wanted the performer to be what I consider to be the most amazing example. And I think that Furtwängler is one of this case for Beethoven, that I maybe would not conduct it exactly the same, but I really like what he does, which I don't for many. I think that it's really there. There is nothing that I can say it's wrong. And it's very, very rare for me these days. And it's the same for the other recordings. They are magical. There are recordings, we just talked about recording. There are recordings where there is not one single mistake in terms of artistic mistakes. They are every note means something, and it's very pure, and it's because you can have a lot of emotion, but it's a bit vulgar. These people are at the opposite of vulgarity. There's something humanistic. There's something very, very great about it. And that's why I chose these ones. But I had other ones. I had a list first. I went and I started by a list of, because when I was young, I listened to a lot of music, but we were not rich. So what I did, I mean, for people that are young, you had these tapes that you could record that disappeared a long time ago, and I would listen to there was I grew up in France, and there was a classic radio that was called France Musique, and you could know in advance. They printed the program 1 week in advance, and you could know everything that was going to be in the week, hour by hour, with the name of the performers and everything. And I would get ready, and I would make some tapes, and I had hundreds of tapes because it was cheap. I could just record it, and I knew by memory these hundreds of recordings. And when you ask me, of course, now it's a fantastic time, because there was a time where, I mean, now these days you go on YouTube or you go on Idagio or you have so much that you can access. It's just that the difficulty of it is that if you are not, because there are millions of things, people don't know where to look for them.
Yeah.
That's a difficulty for any, when it's not your field, it becomes very difficult, whatever it is. So I started with about 60 recordings that I really loved. And I found all of them on Idagio. And then I sort of narrowed down. I said, okay, let's divide it by 2. I got to 30, and then eventually. So that's
but
why.
That's specifically why I asked my guest to name a few recordings. Not because we necessarily will talk about them in the conversation, but because after the conversation, when my listener discovers you, if he doesn't or she doesn't know you already, or if it's an artist, I recently had Placido Domingo, most people know him, but they still want to know more about him. To understand the tastes and preference and ideas of my guest is a way in, and it's a means of leading them to this Fifth Symphony by Beethoven and not another performance, but then people can do comparative listening. The joy of music, yes.
Did you find in other musicians? But for me, the listening to recordings was a very important thing in my formative years. So I say between age 6 to age 20. But now I listen to music in my head. I buy the score and I just don't. That's how I do it. But it's been like that for 30 years, where I tend to do just that. And I don't know if it's true for other musicians or if typical composers or conductors, I don't know. But for me, it's been like that for a long time. That's probably why you get also these recordings.
James Levine, with whom I worked once, said to me that he always has music in his head. And that we were sitting having a conversation one day about the Mozart 40th Symphony. And I said, what music do you have in your head? He said, Schubert. And I said, why Schubert? He said, that's what's playing right now. It's kind of like he had his own personal Walkman or, earbuds that, or like the, France music playlist that would come up. Somehow in his head, Schubert was playing, but he could speak to me in language about a Mozart symphony. Or he might have Richard Strauss in his, who knows what, Elliott Carter, whatever he had in his head at any time, it was going on there. But he could function simultaneously with the music playing and conducting, not the wrong word, and living his daily life. And conversing and being very rational about what he was talking about. My father, too, always had music in his head, always. And I would occasionally say to him, Dad, what do you hear right now? And he would tell me what he heard. And he would even, in his head, he would conflate a performer. So he would take, he loved a lot of Gershwin, he would take Ella Fitzgerald and not necessarily in his head a recording of Ella Fitzgerald singing Summertime, but he would in his head have Summertime and in his head have Ella Fitzgerald, and only in his head would she be singing Summertime the way he understood the music and understood her musicianship. And that's the source of happiness. That's
absolutely. Sometimes my daughter, she sees me sort of. I'm listening to some music, and she says to my wife, "Oh no, he's conducting because I'm conducting. If I in the air, she's just making a joke.
Yeah.
Because I move sort of like a madman.
It's a curse. It's a curse, but it's a wonderful curse.
Yes, we were in a park the other day, And my wife said, I don't know you. Because I pretend I don't know you, this madman walking and conducting it for the
I
birds.
get it. So Nimrod Borenstein, this was a real delight. Having never spoken with you or met you and only admiring your music, but not knowing the man behind it, I think that my listeners and certainly I came to understand a lot more, and I'm very grateful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for asking this interesting question and this great conversation.